So welcome to University College Cork Global Speaker Series. My name is John O'Halloran and I have the privilege of being the interim president of University College Cork. I'm a proud UCC alumnus and we're really excited to have you joining us here this evening. Throughout 2021, we'll bring a series of conversations into your room from places afar. One of the great joys of online is, of course, that we can reach broadly across the world to enable great conversations to happen. In these conversations, we'll have someone facilitating the conversation, exploring both the challenges and the opportunities facing the world in which we're in today, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change, or the significant geopolitical changes that are happening across the world. Each month, an expert from our global alumni community will discuss this topic, and I hope that you will find it interesting. And really what we're trying to do is to connect you across the world on these amazing topics. What we'd like to do is to explore during these conversations what has happened in the past year, what have we learned, what might we hold on to, or indeed what we might change, and not go back to this very difficult period for our history. What I'd like you to do is to enjoy this series, and I hope that you become inspired by the conversations. And I want to thank the speakers and our facilitators for sharing your time, sharing your expertise, sharing your encouraging and creative practice, and we look forward to having a wonderful series of conversations. Thank you for joining us today, and I wish you well.
Welcome to the inaugural conversation in UCC's Global Speaker Series. This evening, we're delighted to welcome two very distinguished alumni of the university. Professor John Naughton graduated from UCC with a degree in engineering and then moved to Cambridge to pursue further studies, initially applying engineering modelling techniques to social systems. He's currently a senior research fellow at Cambridge University's Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities. He's also Emeritus Professor of the Public Understanding of Technology at the Open University. Many of you will know Professor Naughton from his regular column in The Observer and Guardian. He is the author of a number of books, including A Brief History of the Future, Origins of the Internet, and From Gutenberg to Zuckerberg, What You Really Need to Know About the Internet. His most recent publication, 100 Not Out, A Lockdown Diary, has just come out as a Kindle book. Speaking to Professor Naughton this evening is UCC's Director of Information Services and University Librarian, John Fitzgerald. John graduated from the Faculty of Arts in UCC and is an internationally recognized specialist in the field of library and information science. John represents UCC on a range of local, national and international committees and regularly acts as a reviewer, observer and evaluator of EU-funded projects on behalf of the Commission in the areas of digital culture and cultural heritage. He is the IUA representative on the European Universities Association Expert Group on Open Science. John has overseen the successful completion of many large capital IT and buildings projects at UCC. He's actively involved in institutional strategic planning, in the enhancement of UCC's library buildings and collections, and the development of Cork University Press. This evening, our speakers are going to discuss the role of technology in today's world, covering some of the major challenges and opportunities facing the technology sector and their implications for our wider society. We're delighted to have you both with us this evening, and a very warm welcome to you both.
Thank you very much, Karen, and welcome, John.
Thank you.
Lovely to chat to you. This gloaming.
Darker here.
Yeah, from UCC to Cambridge, but I think it's from home to home also, which is a typically COVID situation and context that we find ourselves in. And I want to welcome all of our viewers and listeners as well. You're all extremely welcome to this conversation. And we're very privileged to have John with us because as well as everything that Karen said, he's also a UCC Alumni Achievement Award winner and awardee rather, and he is also a Mayo man, and Mayo is getting a lot of international press these days, John, isn't it? I think you were born in the town of Ballina, or Ballina, as I've heard it called, in other parts of the world and in other parts of the internet. Could you say a little perhaps about your time in UCC before we get into the technology grist of the evening? A little bit about your time in UCC. Are there any particular memories? Has it influenced you in any particular way?
Well, I was the first member of my family to go to university, and I still vividly remember the day in the autumn of 1964 when I walked up from the Western Road to register, and that was it was then quite a small university. I'm guessing, but I think probably the student number was 2,000 or something like that then, so it was tiny compared to what it is now. But because I was the first member of the family to go to university, and because at that time it seemed like a distant prospect for most of us, I for a long time I didn't think I would get to university. So when I found myself that morning walking up the drive, it was like having died and gone to heaven without the trouble or the expense. I mean, I was completely blown away by it, and because I was a very bookish child. And grew up in non-bookish places, and the idea of going to going to an institution where people were really interested in ideas was an absolutely astonishing liberation for me. So I have vivid memories of it, and of course, those 4 years shaped the way I became. And I got an awful lot from that experience. In fact, I've never understood why anybody would not want to go to university. But I just think it was the most wonderful achievement, and it still is, actually, despite everything.
John,
I was not. I wasn't. I just want to say I decided I'd study engineering, but I think I was a kind of eccentric engineer, because I was interested in lots of things that engineers traditionally have not been. And so I have a feeling that many of my classmates thought I was weird. Of course, maybe they were right, but it was so I studied engineering, but I also had a lot of other experiences in terms of other subjects, other different kinds of books, things that I would never have been able to anticipate or indeed to experience if I hadn't been at university.
Yeah, I think that kind of cross and transdisciplinarity is something that hopefully we're building into our student experience, if you will, or even our curriculum, enabling students of one discipline perhaps to move into or experience another, which may not be cognate necessarily.
Well, the problem is that I was just thinking of that in terms of, you remember that famous lecture? Well, you don't, because you're too young. There's a famous lecture of C.P. Snow's in 1950 about the two cultures. Well, it still kind of holds, in a way, that gap between people who inhabit the world of the arts and humanities on the one hand, and people who are in technology or science on the other.
Yeah, STEM and STEAM.
Yeah.
John, I consider you to be one of the founding thinkers of the internet. Indeed, many of its founders very well, and have written about them and the internet as a phenomenon. And you're also one of its most perceptive critics. And I suppose one of the things that interests me is to know what in your career has been the kind of driving proposition or question in relation to technology that you've been trying to address, or would I say even trying to solve?
Well, first of all, can I modestly correct you? I'm an early historian of the internet, but the internet was invented by people much smarter than me, and I was lucky. Oh, right. Oh, thank you. But the point is that if you wanted to look back and try and impose some kind of order on what's laughingly called my career, you would say it was an interest in the public understanding of this stuff.
Yeah.
When the net really appeared from 1983 onwards, I was riveted by it, and I thought of it as the most interesting thing that had happened in the 20th century in a way, and became a kind of I had utopian dreams for it. I really thought it would transform the world in a good way. So you could describe me now as a recovering utopian, but it was. And the thing that struck me was that it's, first of all, it's a creation of my generation. I'm a baby boomer, and all of the people who built this stuff are baby boomers. I know. I've been lucky enough to know some of them, and they're all my age. So it's kind of, at one level, it's the invention of my generation, and on the other hand, that means that people hold me personally responsible for it now, because they perceive the downsides that society has experienced. They think of as a result of the internet, even though in many cases they're not. But what happened to me at the beginning was that, because I was also, from the beginning, I've also been a newspaper columnist, and for a long time I realized that at least in British newspapers, if you knew anything about anything connected with engineering, then you were immediately regarded as being a subhuman being. You were called a boffin, and you were ignored by Fleet Street and all the rest of it. And so I discovered that the kind of ruling elites in Britain had no idea what was happening, what this technology actually meant. And once I had a conversation with the editor of a major British broadsheet newspaper, who was one of these kind of classic Etonian toughs, and at one point he said to me, in the tone that Lord Emsworth uses when talking to his gardener, he said something like, "Don't you think, dear boy, that this internet thingy is the citizen band radio de nos jours?" And I looked at him, and I remember thinking, "You poor sap, you have no idea what's coming. You have no idea." And then I thought, how could he know? Because that's one of the things that led me to write the history of the thing, to try and explain how it came about. And I've been, therefore, a really avid spectator of it, participant in it to some extent, ever since.
And you went into the Open University and worked in a capacity in terms of the understanding of science, the public understanding of science. And now you're in Cambridge. I know that you have a very important Leverhulme Trust project at the moment as well, don't you?
We had a Leverhulme Trust project for 5 years, which was a project to investigate the link between conspiracy theory and democracy.
Yeah.
And we started that in 2012. And for the first 3 years, our academic colleagues, they had two views about it. One is that the Leverhulme Trust had actually lost its mind by giving money to these people. We got a very big grant to look at this thing called conspiracy theories, which is clearly of no interest to anybody. And our academic colleagues thought, this is a terrible waste of people's time. And it went on like that for 3 years. During that period, we were actually discovering that the prevailing view about conspiracy theories was that, although they're prevalent and always have been in human societies, that basically they didn't do much damage to democracies. In fact, if anything, they had a useful function of keeping nutters off the streets and in their parents' basements, kind of stuff. So there was nothing to worry about. It was peculiar characteristic of human beings that they went in for this kind of stuff. And then in 2016, Donald Trump got elected, and our phones never stopped ringing after that, because Trump, of course, he came to prominence first as a conspiracy theorist himself, and he kind of mainstreamed this, and well, you've seen what happened since, right down to January 6th in the Capitol. So it turned out that we were onto something early, and then the world caught up with us. And we have a new center now for technology and democracy, a 5-year project, which was looking at the implication of this technology for for democracies.
I want to come back to the internet and government in a moment, but one of the questions that I'm sure a lot of people would like me to ask you is, it's a very general question, and it's really, has the internet been a success? And I suppose for me as a librarian, one of the most wonderful manifestations of internet technology has been Wikipedia, has been the creation of this extraordinary utopian, to use your word, cooperative public sphere for the assimilation and validation and dissemination of knowledge. And so we're in the 20th, this year is the 20th birthday actually of Wikipedia. But don't want to focus on Wikipedia per se, but has it been a success? Has the project been a success, do you think?
I don't think there's any question that it has been. The problem is that when we talk about it, we don't often now talk about the internet except in an inaccurate sense. We talk about the products and services of some huge corporations which have essentially appropriated it. But the technology is wonderful, and it was wonderful from day one, and it still is wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But the applications that have become dominant in it are at one level also wonderful for people, but they also have very serious downsides, as we've discovered. So that's the first thing I'd like to say about it. The second thing is that the design of the internet was very deliberate, and it was based on two axioms. The first is that nobody should own it or control it, and secondly, that it should simply do one thing, which is to take data packets in from one end and try to deliver them to the other end. And in the process, the implication of those two axioms were that we designed a network that was an architecture for what later came to be called permissionless innovation. In other words, if you had an idea and you were smart enough to be able to realize that idea using data packets, then the internet would do it for you, no questions asked. And there's never been a network like that before. And from that, you got this amazing explosion of creativity, because many people are very smart and they can write the code, and they were able to take this infrastructure and use it for all kinds of things. Just think of, for example, voice over IP, which became Skype and everything. Well, that was two people thinking we could convert voice into data packets and the internet would do it, and so on. So we had this great arc, and then along in the late 1980s, along comes an English computer scientist called Tim Berners-Lee, and he's working at CERN in Geneva, and he has an idea for something that could be done using the internet. He calls it the World Wide Web. He in a year, more or less, he single-handedly invents everything that needed to make it work. And then when his employer is not interested in it, he puts it on their internet server and releases it to the world. Okay, and then you have the World Wide Web. Okay, and the point about the World Wide Web is that, like the platform on which it ran, it was permissionless. You didn't have to ask any permission to do anything. Tim didn't either. And from that, you get this preposterous idea of Wikipedia, where you can build an encyclopedia that anybody can write in, can contribute to, can edit, and so on. And that's permissionless, like the web itself was. And we get this amazing global resource, which I think is one of the wonders of the world. At the beginning, I think, the academic world was very skeptical about Wikipedia. I think it's less so now. At least I hope it is.
Yeah. Hello, John. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Great. So my colleague here is asking me to find headphones and put them on because there may be a little bit of feedback. So let me do that. But what I also wanted to ask you and to revert to again is that Wikipedia instance, if you like, and to I've heard you speak very interestingly about Wikipedia, especially with how you deal with the skeptics. Those who either say that it's not worth it, or those who say that it's inaccurate.
Yeah, I mean, I've had it so often that because I was fascinated by Wikipedia from the very beginning. I'm particularly fascinated by some of the things they built into it and why they built them in. But of course, at the beginning, you if you were enthusiastic about Wikipedia, you always ran into people, especially in academic life, who were very dismissive of it. And then later on, as it developed, as it improbably survived and thrived, you had people who took the other view about it, which is that they would say it's absolutely, oh, isn't Wikipedia wonderful? And I had this so often that I developed a kind of a trope for both types of responses. So the person who says, well, actually, Wikipedia is terrible, it's full of errors, and my response was, so there's a mistake in Wikipedia? I said, yes, absolutely, it's full of them. I said, well, why haven't you corrected it? Dead silence. And then there's the other one, which is, I think Wikipedia is absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And my reply then is, well, then have you donated to it recently? Again, they get the same kind of embarrassed response. But the truth is, it's one of the wonders of the world. It really is. And the most interesting thing about Wikipedia was, and the thing that puzzled people at the beginning, is why did they invent this very strange system? Because every single edit in Wikipedia is logged and accessible. So you can trace the entire history of a page on Wikipedia back to the moment it was first created, step by step, in the open. And this elaborate system of cross-checking that they have, and the rules they've built up about citation and so on. Why did they go to all that trouble at the beginning? And the answer is, it turns out that they realized that there would come a time when every single bit of knowledge would be disputed. And they anticipated fake news by 20 years. And they built an architecture for checking and for that was a really intelligent attempt to deal with the problem that we are now all grappling with.
An authority file, as it were.
Yeah.
Fascinating. John, just reverting back to that that theme that we touched on, the if you like, the internet and government. Do you think, again, a general question, do you think it has been good for democracy and personal freedom, the internet? I mean, in broad terms, yes, but increasingly, particularly in the last 6 months, there have been some worrying developments, haven't there?
There have been a long time in the making. The first thing I'd like to say is that there is a tendency to, and I think a mistaken tendency, to attribute almost everything that's gone wrong with our world to this technology. And I think that's mad, because what it omits to recognize is that for the last 40 years, democratic states have been heading into this desperate situation. For example, we've had astonishingly growing inequality over 40 years. We've had colossal inequalities in wealth. We've had the decline in state welfare states, the growth of huge corporations which don't pay tax, and so on. Now, you can't look back on what's happened in the last, what we realize has happened in the last 10 years and say, oh, well, that's all to do with the internet. It isn't. It's to do with the way in which our democracies have been governed for at least 40 years. I would say misgoverned in many cases. It's to do with globalization. It's to do with deregulation. It's to do with all kinds of other things. And because the technology is still relatively new in most people's eyes, it's a convenient whipping boy. Well, now, that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is that you have to make a distinction between the internet itself, the internet as a network, which exists independently of everything else still, has all the capabilities that it had at the beginning, What happened to the internet is that it got kind of captured by corporate interests, a small number of companies that became very large, which then created a kind of a set of walled gardens within which most people now operate. And the trouble is that most people seem to now think that, say, Facebook is the internet, or Google is the internet, or even the World Wide Web is the internet. It's not. The internet is underpinning all of that, but we don't see that anymore, and largely that's because it was captured. And I said I was a recovering utopian, but utopians tend to be naive, and indeed I was. And one of the things we underestimated at the beginning was that one day this gloriously liberating technology would be captured by corporate interests, because that has happened before. It happened with the telephone, it happened with broadcast radio and TV, and it happened with the movies. All of those communication technologies started off, like the internet, gloriously free. They encouraged utopian dreams and so on, and in the end they were captured by corporate interests. And the big question at the end of the 20th century was, would this happen to the internet? And the answer is, now we know the answer, which is it did. But the thing itself remains clear. The web is not the internet. Facebook is not the internet. Google is not the internet. The internet is that network that my generation invented and is still running fine.
And where does data ownership fall in this? This triangulation between, if you like, state, individual, and corporation?
Well, in order to understand what's happened to data, you have to understand the political economy of the companies. I mean, what happened essentially is that you could divide the world in a way into two eras. There's before Google and after Google. It's like BC and AD. When Google arrived, I remembered vividly when it first arrived, when it first showed up. The minute you saw it, you knew this is much better than anything we've seen before in search. It was utterly brilliant. And it was brilliant because it was based on a very, very good academic idea, a kind of automated peer review. It was on the basis of that the two boys founded Google. When they founded it, they didn't have a business model. They initially, I think, hijacked a lot of Stanford's servers without telling the authorities that they were using them for the purpose of building their machine for crawling the web. But basically, they were running this thing for 2 years. They had money from two venture capitalists, which they were burning at an impressive rate. And then comes the dot-com boom in 2000, dot-com bust in 2000. And suddenly the two venture capitalists come back to Google and they say, listen, boys, you have to have a business model. You have to make some revenue. Remember that? Revenue? And they didn't have an idea of how to do it, except that they had eventually a kind of inspiration, which was that in order to make Google search so good and in order to improve it so quickly, what they did is they logged everything that users did, and fed that back into their machine learning algorithms, which improved the search process. So that they were monitoring everything, and they were using what the logs were telling them in order to improve the service. And then they realized that those logs might be worth something. You could use them as a feedstock to a machine learning algorithm, which would then produce as an output really good ideas about what that particular searcher was really interested in. And they suddenly realized they had the makings of an amazing business. And the business came to be called surveillance capitalism. And suddenly Google, which was making no money and burning it like it was going out of fashion, started to make serious money. Its revenues increased in the 4 years before it went to IPO, something nearly 4,000%. Now that's what happened. And what that meant was that the data that we gave up freely in searching and looking for things suddenly became monetizable and very valuable, because you could use it you could use it to kind of predict what people might want, what they might do, and so on. And from then it goes on. That particular idea was then spread from Google to Facebook via a woman called Sheryl Sandberg, who worked at Google, understood the magic that they had discovered and brought it with her to Facebook. So she became known as the Typhoid Mary of the surveillance capitalism business. She took the infection from Google to Facebook, and that's what happened.
Yeah.
And the process led to the capture of the network.
Isn't it interesting? We were talking earlier about Google and news and what's happening, for instance, in Australia at the moment, where Google is being asked essentially to pay its sources for the news that it transmits. So it's a similar principle, isn't it? It
is. But the interesting thing about the Google Australia case is that one of the things that happened, as you know, as a librarian, you know, that once the web arrived, it more or less vaporized the business model that kept traditional journalism going. Newspapers are a value chain. They combine a loss-making and expensive business called journalism with a very profitable business called advertising. And once in the mid-1990s, when it became clear that the web could do classified advertising better than paper, at that moment, newspapers were doomed in a way because their value chain had dissolved. They only had the costs, the journalism, and they didn't have the revenues anymore. So and that process, of course, has been accelerated ever since. And the tech companies, particularly the surveillance capitalist companies like Google and Facebook, have profited mightily from that. But the thing is that democracies need local news. In particular, they need local news. They need reporters that go to the courts. They need reporters who go and watch what happens in local authorities and watch what the police are up to and all the rest of it. And all of those things have been leached away from our democracies by huge corporations which have simply milked all the advertising out of the system. And the interesting thing about the Australians is that actually behind the stance that they're saying to a company, you have destroyed the business model for an activity that's important for for democracy, and then you don't even pay your taxes.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, come on, wise up. You can't go on like this. And in that sense, I think that argument is correct. These companies have had a free ride for 2 decades, and it's time it ended.
I suppose the irony in Australia's case is that all of the revenue would go to Rupert Murdoch, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I know. I know. Yeah, I know. But that, I mean, I think there's a case for actually having a tax on these companies, which is used to fund public service journalism.
Yeah.
But that's what it should be. It should be called a tax, and it should be levied as a tax.
Yeah.
If they're going to do this kind of damage to our societies, then they ought to pay some restitution.
Yeah. Yeah. That is the ideal ecosystem, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. I mean, they have become the biggest and most dominant creatures in our ecosystem. And the previously dominant ones, were newspapers and so on, and TV to some extent, and radio, they've had to adjust to a more modest role in the ecosystem. But societies are changed. Societies are shaped by their information ecosystems, and if you change the ecosystem, then you change the society, and that's what's happened. We're seeing the effects of that all the time.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting also when you see the revenues, the levels of income that are coming to the hardware people, to the device manufacturers, Apple being the outstanding example. Its sales surged over Christmas into tens of billions of revenue, and up until recently, Apple didn't practice any corporate social responsibility with cash in the bank of, I think it's hundreds of billions at this stage. And whether what moral obligation have they? Should they feel? Do they have in terms of trying to invest in the world that they support and they provide access to. It's a big question. A similar question, I think, could be posed around education. And I want to move into the topic of education with you, John, if I may, because we have a lot of alumni on the call, I understand, and obviously people who would be familiar with the university, as students and indeed as staff members. And I suppose a question that's on everybody's mind at the moment, particularly over the last year, when we've had to pivot into an online mode of teaching and learning, and indeed conducting research remotely in many cases, in many ways, is that, will physical social teaching and learning survive? Whatever about universities surviving, and I know that again you've written and you've spoken on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing about pandemics, it turns out, we now discover, is that they accelerate history. They make things happen quicker than they would have happened normally. I used to guess once that it would take another 10 years to get more people working from home. Well, guess what? It happened in 3 weeks. But way back in 1995, a wonderful guy called Alain Noam from Columbia wrote an amazing paper which was published in Science. It was called Electronics and the Dim Future of the University. And basically in that paper, he laid out what he thought the implications of this technology were for universities. Universities are based on the idea that the knowledge is in a place, and that you bring students to the knowledge, and the scholars and the libraries and all the rest were there in the rest. And that's been the model for 800 years or more. But what happens, Noam asked, if the technology means that you don't have to do lots of that? What happens then? And the answer is, what happens is what is now happening, which is that we discover that we can't bring the students in the same way to university, to physical places, and we don't need to bring the scholars together necessarily, except for laboratories and things like that. But so the point being that in those circumstances, Noam argued at the end, universities are going to have a really good reason for bringing young people together, other than that they can engage in oblivion drinking and all the other stuff. And also going to have to be a good justification for paying, in the United States cases, colossal fees, tuition fees and other things. Now, when Noam's paper came out, we saw it in the Open University and we understood it, because we worked in an institution where we had no students present, and we had developed this technology ahead of anybody else in order to try and teach at a distance and so on and so forth. But the thing that was very striking was that nobody in traditional universities read the paper. I couldn't believe it. I used to ask vice chancellors when I met them, have you read Ellie Noam's paper? And say, who's Ellie Noam? And then, I'm not kidding. I mean, and so what you realize is that it takes a long time for a radical idea to dawn on an entrenched sort of set of institutions. And I think that was a long time coming. Now, what have we learned from the pandemic so far? Well, what we have learned is that we can kind of do some of this without having people in the same place. That doesn't mean there aren't important things to be got from having people together. And in a way, the pandemic has taught us that too. I mean, you see the wistful ways in which people talk about being able to shake somebody's hand, or being able to, to clap somebody on the shoulder, or we can't, it's clear there's a human need for this kind of companionship and presence and physical presence and the rest of it. We have a new research center in Cambridge, which started up in the middle at the start of the pandemic. So we've recruited researchers, but I haven't seen them physically yet. We used to, in the old days, we would meet once a week, every Wednesday morning, around the table for the morning to debate and argue and do all the other things you do physically. And we fight over the chocolate biscuits as well. But you can't. None of that's happened, and it feels. I mean, we are communicating and so on, but it feels weird and unsatisfactory. So there is some value in having people physically together, but it comes at a colossal cost as well. And so some of it we need and we need to have good articulate reasons for doing that. It's not just to bring students together so they can get drunk on Saturday nights. We have to, there has to be some justification for this, and there is. But universities as a set of institutions have got to really rethink their rationale in the as a light of what has happened. And given that the technology has shown that some things that were hitherto done face-to-face perhaps don't need to be. And across the world, I think universities are kind of grappling with that at the moment.
Yeah. And John, do you think that technology generally has kind of alienated people? There are a lot of, worries about technology through algorithms and apps is conditioning human behavior at the personal level that has serious and worrying implications for community and for the development of collective identity.
Well, Martin Heidegger had this wonderful saying where he said that technology is the art of arranging the world so you don't have to experience it. And every time you go, in the old days when you went to Glastonbury or something and you saw the Rolling Stones, the Rolling Stones played Glastonbury once, I remember, one Saturday night, and it was an amazing occasion. And I remember watching it on TV, and I was kind of envying the people who were there. Some of my children were there, and indeed one of my grandsons, I think, that night. And I thought, this is wonderful, absolutely wonderful to be there. It must be wonderful to be there. And I was sitting at home watching it and the rest of it. What did I see? I saw a kind of whole forest of smartphones.
Yeah.
So there were people there who weren't actually there, really. They weren't experiencing it, I don't think, in any kind of really profound way. They were kind of recording it for further, and that's when Heidegger came to my mind. Okay. Now, it's also the case, though, that most of the downsides that people are concerned about are not so much a product of the technology. They're a product of the way in which the technology is exploited by a small number of companies. That's why, and what they possibly don't appreciate is the extent to which the kinds of applied psychological research that goes into the design of slot machines also goes into the design of smartphone apps. So, for example, in a slot machine, it's very important that you keep people going, and you keep them going. Supposing you're playing a game which requires 5 apples in a row. Well, the algorithm that runs the slot machine sometimes shows you 4 apples, and you can glimpse the last one, but you don't get it. Okay. Well, guess what? You look at your Instagram feed, or you look at your at any of these things on your smartphone, and you find that they satisfy you most of what you need, but not quite. There's always something else. There was a wonderful piece of research years ago when somebody understood that if you changed, this is in the ancient days when Facebook was used by young people, but one of the things was that if you changed your profile picture, then that made you entered into a state apparently of anxiety. I've never had problems with anxiety about my image because I've given up on it many years ago, but people did. They were slightly anxious. What did they do then? What they then did is they more intensively checked their friends to see, looking for a reaction to their new picture, right? And as you know, the priority in Facebook algorithms is to maximize user engagement.
Yeah.
So the algorithm knows that. And what it was doing was, once you changed your profile picture, it made sure that your friends knew about it quickly. Okay, now innocent people, kind of, that's the kind of thing that goes into these things, and it isn't, as it were, the technology. It's the business model of the companies that exploit the technology that does it. There's a very interesting film called The Social Dilemma, which explores some of this. It's a bit crass in places, but actually some of it is pretty accurate and rather nice.
Yeah. John, thank you. What I'd like to do now is to engage some questions from listeners and viewers. I apologize if there's a little bit of feedback from my voice, but I have on my screen here, on the right-hand side of my screen, some questions that Karen has relayed into me and us. I think you might be able to see them as well. And I was wondering if we could spend a few minutes perhaps browsing some of these, answering some of these questions. There's one that is particularly interesting, and that is that, should intelligent technology have legal rights and legal obligations? Very interesting.
It is interesting. I think by intelligent technology, I take it that the person who asked the question was thinking about robots.
Yeah, AI,
or at least quotes AI stuff. Well, the answer is I don't think that robots, in the foreseeable future, I can't see us as humans granting legal rights to robots and therefore legal responsibilities. But the answer is simple. The people who own and operate these things have responsibilities, and they have to be enforced. And I think they will be, actually. I do. And that one's not that difficult as a question, I don't think.
Will the internet continue to increase social inequality and division? You touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I really think it's misguided to blame the internet for what has happened to our societies over 40 years. I mean, if you look at Thomas Piketty's wonderful book on capital in the 21st century, there's a wonderful chart in it at one point, which measures inequality. And what it looks like, if you look at the chart over the 20th century, inequality is high up to 1914, then it drops precipitously until the 70s. And then it starts to rise again. And at the moment, we are back at the levels of inequality that obtained before the First World War. Now, why did that happen? Technology may have played some role in it, but it wasn't technology that did this. In the first case, we know that wars reduce inequality, strangely. So we had 2 world wars in that period. And it looks like wars are good for equality. Not that that's a policy prescription, but it. But then we have from the 1970s onwards, you have the breakdown of the old post-war Keynesian world. You have the beginnings of neoliberalism. You have the rise of the idea that the only obligation that companies have is to maximize shareholder value. You have globalization, which is partly, of course, fueled or enabled by the technology, but which means that you can manufacture your stuff anywhere where the labor costs are lowest, and so on. And all of that happened, and it was allowed to happen, and indeed sometimes cheered on by our political masters. And then, then people are surprised that we have this kind of explosion of populism and so on. And you just think back to 2008, you have a banking crisis caused by the most irresponsible and indeed criminal kind of banking behavior. Okay, and in the end, these banks are bailed out by governments. So their debt their losses are somewhat converted into sovereign debts. And then what happens? What happens is that the average citizen winds up in a period of austerity in order to pay. Now, you have this, and no banker goes to jail. Okay, but nothing happens much, actually. And you sit there and think, this cannot happen without a populist backlash. Now, it took a long time to come, but it arrived, and it's running strongly. And the point is that technology might have had some minor role in this, but it's nothing to do with technology, really. It's to do with the way in which our societies have been systematically misgoverned for 40 years, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, when we blame technology for these things, we're a bit like, that famous cartoon somewhere of the drunk under the lamppost, and the policeman asking him, what are you looking for? And he said, I dropped my car keys. And the policeman said, did you drop them around here? And he said, no, I dropped them over there. And well, why are you looking here? It's because there's some light. We've got something to blame, so we go for it. And the thing we blame is technology.
Yeah.
And I think that's wrong.
Yeah. And there's another question, which is an interesting one. I have a question for John. Does he foresee a time when the internet or the World Wide Web, in brackets, will be regulated, or indeed, can it be regulated? We've spoken about the regulation of corporates, as it were, but I think this question probably refers to the internet as the medium.
Right. Well, the answer to that is yes. It can be regulated and controlled. And it is being done very cleverly and adroitly by the Chinese. One of the classical, we have, I think, been misreading in a patronizing way the Chinese for the last, well, since Richard Nixon's time, which was that to say that, well, first of all, if they wanted to have capitalism, then they had to have democracy. And the Chinese said, well, actually, no, thank you very much. We'll just have the capitalism. And we won't bother with the democracy. And then along comes Bill Clinton and co. And he says, because the Chinese were then suddenly keen on the internet. And Bill Clinton had this famous thing where he said, well, if they're going to have the internet, they're going to have freedom and openness. And the Chinese said, no, we won't bother with the openness. We'll just have the internet. And so it goes on. But the way in which the Chinese Communist Party controls the internet in China is a wonder to behold. It's fantastically sophisticated, and they put an awful lot of effort into it. Maybe 250,000 people employed on it. And it isn't about the Great Firewall of China. It's about monitoring and exploiting social media. There's a wonderful work on this by Gary King and his colleagues in Harvard. And what they discovered, they wanted to find out why are some, because they discovered that the Chinese social media is as raucous as ours. It's not subdued at all. It's a very vigorous public sphere. But some things get taken down. And they get taken down, bang, like that. Pornography is one. But there are other things that got taken down. And Gary King and co. set up a very clever experiment to find out what gets taken down. And the answer they came up with was, what gets taken down is anything that appears on social media that might lead to political mobilization on the street.
Yeah.
And that includes social media debates which are hysterically in favor of the Chinese Communist Party. They just don't want anything that involves. Now, that's clever, smart. The other thing they realized, because the Chinese Politburo at one time, at any rate, had a majority of engineers on it, people with an engineering background, and engineers tend to be very technocratic. And what I think they must have realized is that if we're trying to govern a huge state from the center, and we don't have any feedback mechanisms of the kind that democracies have with elections, we need some other method. So actually we have one, it's called the internet. So that's why so much stuff about local corruption and so on survives on the Chinese social media. It's because it's providing the government with a very useful feedback loop for knowing what's going on. And finally, of course, they use the internet cleverly to post their own messages. So the point about it is that the internet can be managed, really well managed, and they're very good at it. Now, fortunately, at the moment, our governments are too incompetent to do it. That might not last.
Fascinating. John, we're going towards the end of the conversation, and it's been absolutely fascinating. Maybe I could ask you a question. You have a very active public profile, which a lot of us, certainly in the UCC community, we admire and we follow you. You have a wonderful online diary, by the way, which I would recommend people to see. Just Google John Naughton online diary, and you'll get a fabulous diary. It used to be called a blog, but it's more than a blog. John is also a great photographer, and references to, I think, Ulysses, or at least Joyce's The Dead in one of your recent postings, as well as talking about the snow that fell around your home. So very personal, very professional, very interesting. And also you'll find a link in there to the latest Observer articles. But I just wanted to ask you, and of course there is that wonderful Observer column that you're so renowned for. Do you enjoy having that public profile? Do you enjoy your your identity, enduring identity as a journalist, on top of all of the other things you do?
I do. It's funny that, because when I've written for the Observer for a long time, and at one time, the editor-in-chief of the Observer was a very famous Irishman, Conor Cruise O'Brien.
Mm-hmm.
My column then went to bed on Friday nights, and so sometimes often I had to be physically there to do it. And there was this tradition that after things had been passed on, you go to a pub, and Conor Cruise O'Brien was a really serious drinker, and so you went with your heart in your mouth drinking with him, believe me. But one night at one of these things, he said to me at one point, is it true that you were a journalist and an academic? And I said, well, yes, Conor, it is really. And he said, he said, you're just like me. You've got a foot in both graves. And it was very good way of putting it. So I've got a foot in both graves forever. The point about the Observer column is that it's a wonderful sort of, what's the word I want? It's like a soapbox.
Yeah.
Most academics are really pleased when their stuff is read by 20 people. And every so often, and it's very interesting that you get this amazing reach. For example, in the summer of 2013, when Edward Snowden broke cover, the media were obsessed with trivia about Snowden, like, for example, who his girlfriend was, and we were on holidays in France at the time, and I was infuriated by it. And I remember writing a column which started, repeat after me, Edward Snowden is not the story. And I wrote it and sent it off and forgot about it and the rest of it. And meanwhile, back in London, they were looking at the number of internet hits that this thing was bringing up. It was kind of rocketing like that, like a rocket. And I wrote a piece a while back which had 2 million page views.
Wow.
So now you can't predict it. It's very interesting. And there's some things you can predict. If you write anything complimentary about Apple, then you get a storm of protests from people who hate Apple. And if you write something critical of Apple, then you'll get a storm of protests from the Apple crowd. And what you realize after a while, that a lot of this stuff that's ostensibly about technology is actually religious.
Yeah.
And Apple is particularly like that. In 1984, Umberto Eco wrote a wonderful newspaper column in which he argued that the Apple Mac was a Catholic product. Because there was one true way, because it came from an argument that Steve Jobs wanted only one button on the mouse, and the user interface experts wanted two, and he wasn't going to have it. There was one button, and that's it. So Umberto Eco had things. So he said that the Mac is a Catholic machine because there's one true way. You follow this way, and you get to salvation. Whereas the PC, the IBM PC, was a Calvinist machine. Because first of all, you had to make your own salvation. You had to figure out about antivirus and all the rest of it. So it was you had to do work on this world in order to achieve salvation. And I still think that that's the case. I encounter arguments about this stuff which are essentially about religion. They're not about objective facts.
Yeah. John, it has been a huge pleasure to chat to you this evening. And we're all very proud of you and your achievements as a member of the UCC family and avid followers of what you do and what you say. And even in the last 50 minutes or so, there's been so much enlightenment, and so you have an ability to provoke a lot of thinking, a lot of rethinking and reassessment, which is tremendous. Thank you to you, and thank you. I know Karen is going to say a few words in a moment to close, but I also want to thank the people who have attended and stayed with us and posted some questions. There were many more questions posted than we had the time to explore, but I do know that John would be in a position to follow up on some of these. So Karen and he will liaise on that front. So Gurmina Mahagut.
John.
And I'll hand over now to Karen.
Professor Naughton and John, thank you both very much for an enlightening discussion this evening, covering topics as diverse as the importance of Wikipedia in fostering a cooperative public sphere on the internet and the role of technology in universities of the future. It's been a fascinating conversation. And continuing on the theme of challenges and opportunities facing our society, the next talk in the Global Speaker Series will take place on February 23rd and will feature Mr. Michael Dowling, CEO of Northwell Health in the US, and Professor Mary Horgan, President of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland and a consultant in infectious diseases. And the topic that evening will be Leading Through a Pandemic, Lessons for the Future. Thanks again, Professor Naughton and John, for a very engaging discussion. And thank you everyone for joining us, and a very good evening to all. Thank you.